I do want to talk a little bit about the way the Gospels have been studied historically. Not the most exciting topic, I know, but this is an important one. Strauss does a nice job of walking you through this. So I just want to highlight a few things from a different angle, or kind of just emphasize a few things. So the first way they've been studied is something called source criticism. And this goes back as far as the 1700s. And when we talk about source criticism, we're talking about, get my PowerPoint up here. And the source criticism, we're talking about, just as the name implies, what are the sources the gospel writers used, right? And specifically, when we talk about source criticism, we're talking about the literary relationship between the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I was asking a class at church here recently. I asked them, "What's your experience reading the Gospels?" And one of the people said, "Well, it's always struck me that they look alike. They look so much alike." And they do in many ways, don't they? And particularly the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so source criticism is looking at the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So there seems to be clear interdependence when we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In other words, somebody's using somebody else. At the literary level, there's clear dependence. Why is that? Why is that so? Why do we believe that? So let me go over a few things here. One is the similarity in wording, right? Obviously, even at the Greek level, or particularly at the Greek level, the similarity in ordering, new word I just made up. I'm dealing with a migraine today, and so hang with me. A little bit of sweet tea and some Tylenol, we're good to go. But the order, clearly, right, the arrangement of the material. We have similar parenthetical material. So in other words, they'll describe an event, but then the author will give us some background information. And there's similarity in biblical quotations. Let me look at one thing here. PowerPoint 14. All right, so we have here evidence for literary dependence. We have comments about the events located in the same place within the narrative. And then we have identical alterations of Old Testament quotes. I'm not going to make this full screen, so I hope you can see this okay. But one of the examples would be here in Matthew 3, Mark 1, and then Luke 3. So this is he who was spoken of through the prophet Isaiah, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. And so, of course, we have the English here, but in the Greek, this is drawing on the Septuagint, so it's following the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible rather than the Masoretic text. But they change it, so the Septuagint would be make straight paths for our God. You see that quote at the bottom? But they all identically alter it and just say make straight paths for him. Things like that lead us to, again, affirm that there's interdependence going on, literary dependence. Another thing is that over 90% of Mark is found in Matthew and Luke. So there's clearly some dependence going on there. What are the theories as far as who's borrowing from who? Well, we go back to Augustine, and we have the Augustinian theory. Augustine said that, and Augustine was an early church father, and he argued that Matthew was written first, and then Mark used Matthew, and then Luke used Matthew and Mark. And this was, pretty much the standard view up through the modern times. And then, so you have the argument there that Matthew was written first. And it looks like Augustine was primarily influenced by the canonical order. Another position would be the Griesbach hypothesis. Griesbach argued that Matthew wrote first, and then Luke, and then Mark uses Matthew and Luke. And that helps highlight, that helps explain the dependence we see between, or the shared, the shared, what's the word I'm looking for? That explains the similar wording we see in Matthew and Luke, right? The agreement we see in Matthew and Luke, that's the word I'm looking for. So that helps there. But the biggest pushback would be why have Mark at all, right? So if Matthew wrote first, and then Matthew wrote first, and then Luke used Matthew, so you have Matthew and Luke, why would Mark write using those two and then abbreviate it so much? You really don't even need Mark, right? Would be the argument. But again, the argument there would say, well, it does explain the agreement we see between Luke and Matthew. When you hear things like triple addition or double addition, it's talking about the events that appear in the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels. So double tradition or triple tradition. Another argument would be the two document hypothesis. And here we see Markan priority. In other words, the argument is Mark wrote first. And I think the evidence supports that view, that Mark wrote first. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But Griesbach said that Mark wrote first, and then Matthew used Mark, and Luke drew on Mark. But what's the other source, right? You got Mark. Well, the other source, the two source hypothesis argues that there's a second source that's referred to as Q, and Q comes from the Greek word the German word that just means source, and so they call it Q. And so you have this idea where Mark and Q are the sources, and Matthew draws on Mark and Q, and Luke draws on Mark and Q. Q, the reason they argue that there's this source Q is because Matthew and Luke shared these sayings of Jesus, right? Where'd they come from? And so they say, well, there must be the source. We don't know if it's an oral source or is it written down? Is it fragmentary? And there's a lot of skepticism, even if the source existed. But that would be the two document hypothesis. And that goes back to 1919, I believe. 1924. No. Is that 1919? Two document. I'm not sure when the two document developed, but I know 1924 is the main date I want you to hold on to. Is when B.H. Streeter developed that further into the four document hypothesis. And what Streeter said was, let me get my screen here. So what Streeter was saying in 1924 was, yes, you have Mark as the first one written, right? Mark, and then you have Q, and then Matthew draws on both, and then Luke draws on both, right? But Streeter said there's also material specific to Luke, and there's material specific to Matthew. And so you have M and L. And so when he says four document, that's what he's talking about here. He's adding material specific to Matthew and then to Luke. So my computer's not wanting to work too well here. A little bit squiggly, but I hope that makes sense to you. Four document. My migraine must be affecting my computer here. So now the four document hypothesis is certainly the most proposed or held to today. And again, this came out in 1924, the four document hypothesis. I would say this, as you talk with your classes and as you teach, there's going to be questions about that, right? Who wrote first, and why did it look so similar? And this is the kind of thing that is very helpful just to tell your class, well, you have something called Markan priority, or you could just say, hey, Mark was very likely written first. And y'all excuse me, I'm leaning over a bunch of stuff here. I hope this is legible. You can say, Mark likely wrote first, and then Matthew and Luke drew upon Mark. And over 90%, around 90% or more of Mark is incorporated into Matthew and into Luke. And then they incorporated it and developed their own theological portrait of Jesus Christ. There is also suggested that there's a second source named Q that has writings of Jesus that it seems Matthew and Luke draw from. And that is, you could also say there's skepticism of whether Q existed or this source existed, talk in terms that your audience can understand. But I think the big thing here is just talking about Markan priority, or that Mark was written first. That seems to be, I think, where scholarship is the strongest, and that Matthew and Luke incorporated such a large chunk of Mark into their own gospel and then developed it, again, by this guidance of the Holy Spirit into their own unique presentation. The other one I would mention is, and Strauss talks about this, is Ferrer. Ferrer said, well, do we really need Q? Right? Ferrer said he held to Markan priority. And he said, but this is 1955 when he wrote this. But he said, well, what about Mark writing first, and then Matthew uses Mark, and then Luke uses Matthew and Mark, right? And so you have this Markan priority, and then Matthew uses Mark, and then Luke uses both, right? And so that helps explain the agreement between Matthew and Luke. And he says you really don't even need Q, right? And that would be the argument there. Again, there is, ongoing debate. This is called the synoptic problem, if you ever hear it referred to that way. But these are things you're going to come across in your reading, you may have already. But again, I would hold to just the main thing is Markan priority. Mark wrote first. Let's talk about why we see that, why we support that. And I would want you to know these for a quiz. Well, one thing is the brevity of Mark. It's easier to understand that Matthew and Luke would expand upon Mark, right? Adding material to it, rather than Mark using Matthew and Luke and just abbreviating or deleting stuff. Again, over 90% of Mark is found in Matthew and Luke. The other thing is just the verbal agreement. Matthew and Mark frequently agree. Luke and Mark, they frequently agree, but rarely do we see Matthew and Luke agree. Only rarely. And as you read in Strauss, another aspect is the how do we want to say this? The primitive grammar of Mark is much more awkward at times. And the argument is that that would tend to be smoothed out, right? Rather than having a smooth phrasing and then make it more awkward. So Mark is more primitive in its grammar, and also more primitive theologically. And by that, it's things like Mark says that Jesus could do no miracles in his hometown, right? Whereas you see that smoothed out later, right? Saying that he did not do any miracles. Maybe there was a tendency to want to smooth that out. That's the argument. Or the Aramaic in Mark is translated in Matthew and Luke, things like that. It would seem that Mark's Aramaic would be the original. All right, so that would be source criticism. The next approach to the study of the Gospels, again, super exciting stuff, I know, but this is stuff you're going to hear about and read about. So form criticism comes around 1919, applied to the Old Testament initially, but in reference to the Gospels, it is looking at the oral tradition behind the sources, right? What led to the writings? And so looking at that oral tradition of the stories. Let's talk about some of the assumptions of form critics. So one would be that the early Christian community, you had this oral time period, right, where stories are being told, and they adapted these stories, changed them to meet the needs of their own community. So do you hear what's going on there? The assumption is that, yes, there's this period of oral sharing of the stories of Jesus, and the various communities adapted them to help them in their situations. Another assumption is that the stories took on certain forms. So you had Jesus's proclamation stories, his miracle stories, parables, that type of thing. Another assumption is that by looking at these stories, appreciating the uniqueness of them, you could track kind of historically backward and understand what was known as the Sitz im Leben. You get to say a fancy German phrase there, the life setting of that pericope, of that unit, of that story. There's obviously this is problematic. It's true, we want to affirm that there was likely a period of oral transmission of the text, probably not as long as the form critics would like to say, probably shorter than that. Also, it tends to minimize or dismiss the way the stories were preserved. This was an oral society, and their ability to handle these traditions and to remember and convey word of mouth what Jesus said and what he did. And so we want to appreciate that. I think there's an overstatement there. Let me look at a few things from this slide here. I wanted to share a few things with you. So again, positives, preaching of the gospel in the early church. The stories likely did they were transmitted in certain units, right? People told stories about Jesus healing or him proclaiming something, or they talked about his parables. So that's true. But some weaknesses, assumption of the non-historicity, right? They tend to downplay or dismiss the historicity, the truthfulness, or the reality, right? Historical reality of these units, of these genres. They're saying, well, the early church just adapted these stories and made them what they are. There was this anti-supernatural bias, and again, the underlying exclusively oral period. So we want to appreciate the oral tradition was there, probably not as long as they held, and it certainly does have a sense of subjectivity to it, right? Kind of speculating on what that original life setting, Sitz im Leben, was. So it's an era of criticism, but one that has some contributions, but again, limitations as well. Let's see here. Well, we're going to move on to redaction criticism. So let's talk about that briefly. Let me pause here to get a sip of my sweet tea to help me keep going. So redaction criticism. This is our third and last way to approach the Gospels. And we see this really beginning in the, when did form criticism? So form was 1919, and we see redaction in the 1950s. Yeah. But redaction criticism is not looking at the oral tradition or the sources, but it's looking at how those are used. So appreciating that the evangelists, the writers, they didn't just cut and paste things together, but they drew on their sources and edited them, redacted them in a way that they created their own theological presentation of Jesus Christ. This is what Carson and Moo said. They have the argument again by redaction critics that they have creatively and purposefully molded their tradition. In other words, the things that they are taking and using as sources, and they're molding them into a literary whole with a theology of its own. So that is a good contribution of redaction criticism, appreciating that the authors are not simply just cutting and pasting stuff together, right? But they are authors and they are creating their own theological portraits. What are some of the ways redaction critics look for details? Well, they're looking for the way things are edited together, right? Certainly Mark is harder because it's written first, but you compare the synoptics, you compare the Gospels, and look for changes, look for things that would reflect, this is where the author used a source, but he uses it differently here, or he sets it up differently, or the wording is differently, right? So let me give you some examples. Redactive elements would include the materials they chose, right? So that's important. The arrangement of the material, right? Mark did it this way, but look how Luke does it here. They look for seams, or the way the narratives transition. How did they put them together? Right? In other words, how do they transition? They look, of course, for additional material or omissions of material, changing in wording. We see that at times. And so these are some things that they look for. And based on these changes, again, like form criticism, the argument is that they can identify the Sitz im Leben, the setting in the life of the writing. And so let me look at this real quick, this PowerPoint. So redaction criticism, looking how the gospel writers edited their sources. And from this, you can figure out the theological emphases, right? This is the argument. Determine each author's purpose and identify the Sitz im Leben. You can drop that phrase in a conversation later this week. So again, it appreciates that there are theologians with particular emphases and purposes. Do you see that there? Wish I could highlight that for you better. Sorry, I can't. But one of your big takeaways is that if I asked you that on a quiz, just know that redaction criticism helps us appreciate that. It's building on source and form criticism as well. But I wanted to get to 42 here. Let's see here. So some of the methods, individual comments, editorial links, and it's giving examples here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through each one. Methods, so you have summary statements. You look for that. Luke says here, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. And then Luke 3:21, when all the people were being baptized, Jesus was baptized too. And as he was praying, heaven was opened, etc. One of those days, Jesus went out to the mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. Let me move on here. And then additions and omissions of material. Let me see here. And you can see a comparison of Luke and Matthew here, right? Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the desert. And we see the temptation account. Matthew says, and then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert, right? So you see a difference there. You can look at that, full of the Holy Spirit. And then from that, a redaction critic would say, well, what can we draw from that? What theological emphases are we going to come up with? Let me give you some weaknesses here. It depends on the ability to distinguish between what's tradition, right? What were they just looking at and using or drawing on versus what they contributed, what they redacted. Does that make sense? Often a redaction critic will assume that every change or all changes are theologically important. They may not be. Maybe it's just stylistic. A redaction or an edit may show that it's important. It contributes, right, to what's important to the writer, but it doesn't necessarily give us his entire theological focus, right? Or it doesn't give us his whole theology. And so you can see the degree, the subjectivity that's involved in this. So is it helpful? Yeah, it certainly is a helpful approach, but there's also a lot of things you need to be mindful of. And also at times you'll see redaction critics downplaying the historicity of the stories as well. And you can have both, right? It can be historically reliable and also appreciate that the authors were editing material together, guided by the Holy Spirit. Well, we'll stop here. Kind of dry material, I know, talking about historical criticism, but also good stuff, for your ministry. Talking about, why do the Gospels look so similar? Well, you talk about Mark and priority and interdependence, Matthew and Luke using Mark, etc. With form criticism, it helps us appreciate that oral tradition behind the writings and how they circulated in certain stories and units. And then redaction criticism, appreciating how each evangelist is their own author, and they're not just cutting and pasting stuff, but they're editing and redacting. And when we look at synoptics and we compare differences in wording and that kind of thing, how that can be helpful. So good stuff, and I hope it'll help you as you study and prepare and speak the gospel message into the lives of others.